This is Midday Modern Conversations from Hogarth's House, and today we'll be talking about William Hogarth as a pet owner, pet keeping in the 18th century, and Hogarth's affectionate portrayal of animals, not least in the form of his beloved pug, Trump. I'm John Collins, and I have the privilege of managing Hogarth's House, the artist's former home, now a historic house open to the public. I'm joined today by Dr. Stephanie Howard-Smith, historian of human-dog relationships in Georgian Britain. Stephanie has a PhD on the cultural history of the lapdog in the 18th century from Queen Mary University of London, and in 2016 curated an exhibition on William Hogarth and animals at Hogarth's House. Hello, Stephanie.
Hello, John.
Let's dive straight in to talk about Hogarth and a man who, a fan of portraying himself in self-portraits, and perhaps his most famous self-portrait doesn't just have him in, it has his pug in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing about self-portrait with pug or painter and his pug is that it's not just a portrait of William Hogarth and Trump, his pug. It's actually, when you look at it, Trump is the living thing in that portrait. Hogarth himself appears as a portrait within a portrait. And obviously, Trump is in a privileged position. He's positioned in front of the portrait itself. So at the time, we know that when people were talking about self-portrait with pug or painter and pug, they really were struck by the fact that it's a portrait of a man and a dog, not a man with a dog, but the two kind of presented deliberately as equals. And this is something that really bothered people at the time. It was quite unusual and something that drew a lot of comment.
Its unusualness is that Hogarth himself is unusually affectionate towards his pets, towards animals, and I think it's a very interesting kind of trait as him as a man.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that comes through in so much of his work, not just his work, which is particularly about animal cruelty, things like the 4 stages of cruelty, but the way animals are really carefully and lovingly presented throughout his work, or occasionally humorously presented as well. Yeah, unusual for quite a few reasons. But also, they help to humanise him, the pugs, as well. They give us a sense of what he was like as a person, and they're funny like he is as well, which helps kind of connect him as an artist. So we know that Trump wasn't his first pug. His first pug was called Pug, and we know about Pug, the pug, because in December 1730, Hogarth, who has lost him, and is obviously quite distressed about losing Pug, because he puts in an advert in the Craftsman, I think advertising half a guinea reward for Pug. He describes him as a light-coloured Dutch dog, which is what pugs were called then, and says he's become lost from the broadcloth warehouse in Covent Garden's little piazza. So that tells you about his affectionate relationship with that dog anyway. It wasn't
not an
terribly
insignificant amount of money either.
Not an insignificant amount of money. No, exactly. So he's valued. He has a financial value. His emotional value to Hogarth has a financial value, and half a guinea was a kind of typical reward for kind of lost dog adverts, and that was like kind of the standard amount throughout the 18th century. But you wouldn't, if that dog didn't mean anything to you, you would just kind of it'd be lost, because London then was full of wandering animals, wandering dogs. They posed a problem in terms of health and safety. Like, people were always worried about dogs biting them, kind of just roaming the streets. But he wanted Trump back, a pug even back, and he thought that someone could help him find him. But we don't know, obviously, whether that was successful or not. What we do know is that in another 4 years that Trump the pug has popped up, and they, yes, like I say, they have this unusually affectionate relationship. In the house, as you know, there's that lovely stool on the first floor, which was collected, and I love the collection notes. The stool on which a marble cistern once stood, where he laped his water up.
Yeah, sat beneath the drop leaf table in the Oriel window. The Oriel window's there's a drop leaf table, and we have what we think is the plinth you're talking about on loan from Aberdeen Art Gallery, which is there at the house. Not the bowl itself, but perhaps the plinth that it sat on is there. So, as you say, Trump is a part of the household. He's a presence in the house.
And he's got prime position as well. Like, if you're going to have your water bowl anywhere, that's the best place to have it. And I love that they've already thought about that. It's not just in a corner somewhere. It's like, say, in the Oriel window, which is lovely. And that's what I like about the fact that's in the collection on loan, is that you get a sense of the other inhabitants of the household. It's not just Hogarth, and it's not even just the servants. It's, you know, their animal family, I guess, as well, who are there. I understand that you're going to have the tombstones put up at some point. Is that right?
Yeah, there was a crowdfunding project which enabled us. There were records of 2 tombstones, 2 pets in the house. Not to Hogarth's pugs, unfortunately, but very interestingly to what we think was Mrs. Hogarth's dog from after when William died. So Jane Hogarth stayed on in the house, and Jane had a dog. We think one of the memorials is to that dog, and the other seems to be to Dick the Drake, who obviously not a dog, a duck, but obviously there's a great animal affection that's within the household generally.
I'm thinking about Jane Hogarth because one of the few sources we have, which is, I'm going to emphasize, 100% not reliable, is this source that pops up about 1843. It's this woman who claims that she was a maid in the Hogarth household after Hogarth had died. So she was supposedly Jane Hogarth's lady's maid, and she lived a very long life. And so she gives this she talks about, you know, what about the treatment of animals in the household, and she says, you know, Trump was really loved, and everyone knew that he was Hogarth's favourite dog, and he'd go out, I think, at 9 o'clock every evening to try and find Hogarth in the pubs, and he'd go from one pub to the other until he found the one with Hogarth in it, and then it would be like, oh, sir, your man's here your servant or something is here to collect you, and he'd go, oh, ha, and everyone would laugh about it, and then they'd go home together, which is really sweet. I don't know if it's true, but because obviously
it's interesting, isn't it? Even if it's not true, that within a generation or two, the memory of somebody, whether they're faking it or not, whether they're, you know, they've cottoned on to the local celebrity or whether they really were in that role, it seems feasible to make a story about Hogarth and Trump and that affection be something that could be believed. And still, the veracity of it today is still in question because it's plausible. It ties in with everything else we know. And if nothing else, it seems to be a tribute to that sense that it wasn't a fleeting or a passing thing to be affectionate to animals. And perhaps it's useful to put that in a bit of context because obviously Hogarth isn't just a man by himself. He's not just with his family, he's somebody of the 18th century. And perhaps if we talk more widely about pet keeping itself in the 18th century and how typical or not Hogarth was in that sense.
Yeah, so we think about pet keeping historically perhaps as a kind of a Victorian invention. The idea of, you know, imagine kind of a nuclear family with the mum, the dad and the kids and a couple of cats and dogs in a kind of like very cozy Victorian setting. But it was very popular during the 18th century too. Just like now, there's an idea that there are fitting pets for certain people. So just like now, as a cat lover yourself, I know you will have noticed that people think about cats as being women's pets when obviously they're cats. And likewise, small dogs were in the 18th century largely conceived as women's pets, big dogs, hunting dogs, man's pets. And within all these kind of different sections, there are different ideas of what is appropriate to do with that pet and how much affection it's appropriate to bestow on it. And that affection can be love and stroking, but it can also be like letting it into your house in certain rooms. It can be buying things for your pet. It can be doing things with them. And so Hogarth's unusual because not only does he have these lap dogs, pugs, but he has a very emotionally and not semi-financially affectionate relationship with them. So it's things like buying the stool with them, but just generally this kind of like really close affectionate relationship is quite unusual for men at the time. It becomes more common as the century goes on. And then you'll get to the kind of the beginning of the 19th and the 18th century, and you'll see people like Byron who are really, really close to their dogs. And there's this, one of the things that happens over the course of the 18th century is that you go from kind of pet love being a kind of individual foible, something that's kind of a bit quirky and eccentric. And then you get to the point where, firstly, kind of that animals have these qualities that we might want to emulate ourselves, like dogs are loyal, that's good. And then also the idea that an individual dog could be a model citizen in a way, and it's better, and it might even be better than some people. That's kind of an idea that begins to take hold during this period. And then by the time you get to the beginning of the 19th century, The stage is set for the beginning of kind of the animal welfare movement. Things like the RSPCA eventually are founded. So Hogarth's part of the spectrum. He's kind of at this really, really crucial tipping point between kind of the old way of owning a pet and the new way of owning a pet.
And his work as well constantly displays the kind of the moral benefits, and just almost in a kind of attempt to normalize throughout Hogarth's work, kindness to animals is shown as a positive thing. It's not just that he only shows kindness, but when he depicts cruelty to animals, it's seen as something that has consequences. And at the same time, affection and kindness to animals is seen as having both personal and very real world positive consequences throughout all different types of Hogarth's work.
Yeah, absolutely. So many of the people he paints have their pets with them, and they often maybe something that sometimes what they're doing within the work is kind of adding a bit of action. But like the most obvious example of the things we're talking about is something like the 4 stages of cruelty, where this is the kind of the negative side of human-animal relationship. The 4 stages of cruelty is, as you know, obviously done as this really kind of visceral, graphic representation of animal cruelty. At least the first stage is. So this is the kind of the London scene where all the urchins are like poking out pigeons' eyes and swinging cats and organising cockfights, and what it ends with is kind of this natural progression that if you start off, if the kind of circumstances you are born in kind of make you immune to this kind of cruelty, then you'll inevitably end up perpetuating it on someone else. So in that case, he kills his pregnant lover, and this is kind of an older. Hogarth wasn't the first person to kind of think that the kind of if you're so cruel you'll happily maim a bird for fun, then that probably doesn't speak much to how you'll have relationships with people down the line. But he does popularize this idea, definitely, and at a time when other people are doing the same thing, which really helps. And he made sure that when he made the 4 stages of cruelty, that there'd be a woodcut option that was much cheaper, so it'd be more easily disseminated. This was a very carefully thought out and savvy piece of kind of political, not propaganda, but basically propaganda, like a media campaign, like don't burn out pigeons' eyes, because if you do, you'll end up killing their lover and being executed at Tyburn. And eventually the dog has animals kind of get their revenge, because the dog is shown in the dissecting theatre.
It's on the anatomist's table after his execution for murder. So the protagonist's journey, as you say, begins with cruelty to animals, turns to cruelty to people, sees him executed, and being in front of an audience cut open on the anatomist's table. And in a gory but comic scene, the guts fall from his stomach and are being chewed on by a dog at the foot of the table. So it rounds itself very interestingly. And again, you're into depictions of animals in Hogarth as really part of the sort of central moralizing that he does throughout his work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And animals are very good at kind of carrying out that kind of cultural work in any kind of visual media. They were really, really popular in satire, a really handy way to communicate any number of things, from, overindulgence in financial things to even being symbols of countries. It's a really easy shorthand, and that people can kind of get to grips quite easily.
So,
yeah.
Let's talk about the dogs themselves, about Hogarth's dogs. You've already mentioned sort of the idea of a lap dog being associated with something that's more appropriate for a woman. Hogarth obviously is very connected to these 2 pugs that we know he has, and yet something seems to be going on here about Trump and his pugs himself. Why pugs as well? Why have we got Hogarth owning pugs? I mean, I think we think of them as quite a quintessentially 21st century status symbol, and it's certainly kind of their popularity has grown and grown. But what is the place of the pug as a pet anyway?
So just as that you say, think about it as a kind of 21st century thing that's grown and grown. So pugs, and like if you think back to 10 years ago when they were everywhere, the same thing was happening at the beginning of the 18th century. They're one of these dogs that comes in, they just kind of arrive in peaks and then eventually go out, and then they'll come back again. There'll be a big pug trend. And so what's happening at the beginning of the 18th century is that this is the first of these in Britain. They are the it dog. Everyone has a pug, and there are various kind of explanations of this. Like, one of the things that is kind of suggested is that they come in with William and Mary after the revolution of 1788, 1688, 1689, as things from the Netherlands, and they're known in this country as the Dutch dog, which kind of suggested. But just like any kind of, if something's connected to a king or queen, something fashionable, that's going to be popular. And they remain vaguely associated with the Whig Party, who are associated with William and Mary, and they remain associated with the Dutch kind of nation for the entire 18th century. So that's how they kind of arrive, and then they are, like I said, the dog. So George II has one in this period. They are kind of the chosen dog of the fashionable aristocracy. People think nowadays think of them being from China, but there wasn't that association in the 18th century at all. They are very much Dutch dogs.
Isn't the word trump a Dutch word as well?
Yes. So Trump, which is obviously the name of Hogarth Pug Trump, is basically an Anglicization of I think Tromp, which is the name of two admirals during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. So these were well-known Navy commanders. The name would have been recognised in Britain, and it was kind of a stock pug name for much of the 18th century. A bit like, I suppose, if you got a poodle and called it Napoleon, or that kind of thing. It's kind of a jokey nod to their heritage. So when people, and we know that this is Trump's name, it's not something that's been given to him afterwards, because in 1740, when Hogarth goes to the Fost Fair, which is held when the Thames flows over, he gets this little souvenir printed for Trump, which is really unusual for a start, and is a great source. But also, so we know that's the dog's name. So I think what you were saying just then about how it seems really weird that Hogarth, who fosters such a really kind of hardworking artisanal image, like he saw himself as being apart from the aristocracy, and he makes fun of them in all his satires, like A Taste in the High Life. So pugs fit into that world, and Trump doesn't. So you can kind of understand why at the time people kind of mocked him for liking these silly little dogs, but also why even now it's something we kind of feel like we need to explain somehow. So the famous Hogarth scholar Ronald Paulson has suggested maybe it's a pit bull, and that kind of, it speaks to more kind of Hogarth's kind of like a gutsy image. But I think sometimes there doesn't need to be a reason why we like certain animals, and we know he calls Pug a Dutch dog, so, and it's called Pug, and then Trump has a stock pug name. He looks like other pugs do at the time. This is a period before breed standards, when everything was a lot kind of less, everything comes kind of shapeshifty. Like, as long as you call it a pug, it's a pug. If it's a dog with a kind of like lightish coat color and a shortish nose, then at the time, yeah, and we know that's how the people at the time saw them.
Trump's ears are very different, though, aren't they, as well?
Yes, this is one of the ways Trump looks distinctly different from other pugs at the time. And when we were just talking about how Hogarth was opposed to cruelty to animals, at the time it was the trend, the fashion for pugs to have cropped ears. So it was done with their puppies, really close cut to their heads, where they would take kind of the pinnae of the whole pinnae of the ear off, so they look like they don't have any ears, because they don't. And it remained in fashion well into the 19th century, which is funny, because now we think of cropping as something you do to protection dogs or fighting dogs, to make them look mean. But with pugs, it served to make their heads look more round. But Hogarth, who was so attuned to animal pain, obviously felt strongly enough about it. When he got his pug, he didn't crop its ears. I think it's the only image of a pug I found from 18th century Britain where that's the case. So it's a really strong and unusual statement. Something that's quite easy to miss when you're used to seeing pugs now, which have those velvety ears.
And it's odd as well, because both to the 18th century viewer, it's an unusual pug, and to us now, looking at the depiction of a pug, it's a much longer legged, it's a dog that you could actually argue was a different breed, and as you say, that's a different sensibility again. So almost Trump doesn't seem to have an obvious point of recognition, either in the century he was from or the century that we're looking at him now. But the fact that he was so distinct did bring a kind of symbolism of Hogarth and his work, and it made for a sort of rallying point of Hogarth, both for the good and the bad, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So that portrait, Painter and His Pug, is the most iconic one. It's, when I think of Hogarth in my head, I don't know about you, but it's the one that comes to mind. They were, and as we were just saying, but that kind of the servant who has this recollection of working for Jane Hogarth almost 80 years after he died, that's what she that there's interest in Hogarth's relationship with this animal. The statue on Chiswick, I think is it Chiswick High Road?
It is, yeah, the millennium statue,
yeah, accompanied by his pug. They're iconic. And so the good side of this is that well, not good side, but the kind of like neutral side of it is that when people want to talk about Hogarth, they can put a pug in. So in some works, something like the Victorian artist William Howell Frith always includes a pug when he's doing stuff about Hogarth. But the negative side of that at the time, during Hogarth's lifetime, is that the pug was a really easy way to kind of attack him. They worked as a kind of stand-in to the artist. So there are two periods in Hogarth's life when he really attracted bad press. So the first is after he publishes Analysis of Beauty. So the year after it's published in 1753, Paul Sandby, who's another artist working at the time, begins to publish this kind of series of satirical prints attacking Hogarth. And one of the things that's common in almost all of them, is lots of them kind of attack the pug. Either Hogarth is half pug and he's kind of monstrosity, or there are pugs in it. In one of them, there's a pug called Jewel, who lends Hogarth a bone to pick the line of beauty with. So the line of beauty being that kind of famous theory he has, that the serpentine shape is the most perfect and graceful and beautiful thing. And so almost like including an ugly dog to kind of attack him for his aesthetic ideals, which is interesting. And sometimes there's one called, I think, Pug the Painter. So at the time, pug also meant monkey. So because pug, yeah, very helpful. So it's a way, so, you've got that kind of, it's a kind of double play on words, I guess. So painting Hogarth as an animal has the same name as the animals he likes. And my favourite is one where a pug is smelling Hogarth's backside. And then later in the 1760s, he has this falling out with Charles Churchill and John Wilkes. The beef is complicated and too complicated to explain simply, but it ends with Churchill and Wilkes commissioning this satirical print, which has them flogging a pug, which is kind of crying out for mercy. There's like a cat and nine tail, there's blood going everywhere. And this is really like visceral image that it's using the pug in a very carefully controlled, nasty way to kind of get at Hogarth. But there's this understanding, if you saw a pug, you knew it was about William Hogarth, the painter, who's so closely associated with these animals.
So, I mean, Hogarth, obviously, like all of us, won't live forever, and he dies in 1764. But do we know what happened to Trump?
So we've talked about the graveyard, and as you noted, there are two animals who have gravestones. One is Dick the Drake. The other is Pompey, who's Jane Hogarth's lapdog. But Trump isn't buried there. So what Jane Hogarth's servant says is that he was taxidermied and he stayed on a kind of mantelpiece in the hall in Hogarth's house, which is unusual because taxidermy wasn't a very popular or even, I'm trying to say this nicely, skilled craft at the time. 18th century taxidermy isn't pretty, but the servant says that this specimen looked good for a long time, which is obviously quite unlikely. There's a chance that maybe sitting in someone's attic is Hogarth's pug Trump, stuffed and mouldy and moth-eaten and waiting for someone to find him, just as Louis Roubiliac's bust of Hogarth, which really came with a statue of Trump, which was recreated in kind of the Chelsea porcelain factory. So there are loads of copies of this lost Trump, but not the original itself. So Trump and terracotta Trump remain missing action, but their image is ubiquitous, both in those Trumps have in house and in portraits of Hogarth everywhere. This is one of the ways he's kind of left his legacy in this kind of like mini market of pug memorabilia. And his last self-portrait, Hogarth painting The Comic Muse, would have originally had a pug in it. When the National Portrait Gallery did some X-rays on the portrait back in the 1960s, they found that it originally had a pug urinating on a pile of pictures, and Hogarth obviously thought better of it at some point and covered it up. So that's kind of, I suppose, one of Trump's kind of lasting memories. Because if we assume that he got Trump in 1732-ish, to be featured in A Rake's Progress in 1734. He must have been quite old by the time that kind of self-portrait with Pug was finished in 1745. He's probably dead already.
He probably is,
which is a funny thing to think about.
But adds another layer as well to the kind of, if that timeline's the case, the degree of tribute that comes with it, and a perspective, as you were saying, about Hogarth is contained his image as an image within that portrait, and the prominent to the foreground is the dog. So perhaps it's less a portrait of Hogarth and more of Trump.
A tribute to Trump, absolutely, and I think that's really touching. And the fact that he made so much of their shared resemblance that something people still pick up now. You can't miss it. The way their kind of foreheads look a bit like each other. It's this, really touching, loving portrait, a testament to a relationship between a dog and a person that's quite unusual for its time.
Stephanie, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. We hope everybody's enjoyed listening to and watching this, the first of our midday Modern Conversations. We'll be back with more, but for now, thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me, John.
And thank you very much to everyone else. If you want to find out more about Hogarth's House, you can go to our website. You can find us on all our social media as well. We'd be delighted to hear from you, and stay looking at all those channels for more news. Thanks very much, everyone.